Okay. Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight. We'll just wait another minute or so. People are trickling in.
We have about 51 so far. Let's wait another few seconds. All right, I think we are ready to begin. We have 52 people who have registered to attend. Good evening and welcome to the Zoom webinar, Islam and Democracy. My name is Brian Smith, Professor Emeritus of Religion at Ripon College and co-director of the Center for Politics and the People. With me tonight is, as co-host, is my colleague, co-director of the Center, Professor Henrik Schatzinger of the Politics and Government Department. Each academic year, the Center tries to sponsor at least one discussion of a topic relating to an international political or policy issue. This evening, the focus of our webinar is on the relationship of the Islamic religion and democracy in contemporary global society. Americans do not often receive accurate information about Islam in the media or how it interacts with political systems in majority Islamic countries. Their common impression sometimes is that the Islamic religion promotes authoritarianism and violence, and that it is incompatible with human rights and representative forms of government. There is little understanding that the problems in these majority Muslim countries come from the political culture rather than from the religion. Many Americans also are not aware that there are examples of majority Islamic countries today where hospitable relationships do exist and have for some time between democratic governments and religious leaders and followers. And so tonight we have two distinguished scholars to inform us better about the relationship of Islam and politics, particularly about Islam and democracy. First, we have Dr. Ali Abu, I'm going to mispronounce your name, I'm sorry. You're Ali to me. Dr. Ali Abu Talebi was born in Tehran, Iran. He earned his 2 master's degrees in international studies and political science from the universities of Washington in 1984 and Arizona in 1991, and his PhD in political science from the University of Arizona in 1993. He has been teaching courses in Middle Eastern and global politics for the past 20 years, and he currently is professor of Middle Eastern and global politics at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. He is author of the book, Islam and Democracy, State-Society Relations in Developing Countries, 1980 to 1994. He has published chapters on Islam and politics in several edited collections, and his articles on this topic have appeared in refereed journals such as Iran Analysis Quarterly, Turkish Policy Quarterly, Middle East Review of International Affairs, and the Journal of Developing Areas. Professor Abu Talebi is also a member of the Speakers Program for the Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, and we are grateful for his time and expertise in this capacity tonight. Our second panelist is Dr. Alexander Arifianto, known as Alex, and he's well remembered by Ripon College long-timers as one of our most scholarly, successful, and distinguished alums. He was born in Surabaya in Indonesia and earned a BA in economics and sociology from Ripon College in 1999, then an MA in international affairs from the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in 2007, and finally a PhD in political science from Arizona State University in 2012. He currently is a research fellow with the Indonesia program, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And so he is 14 hours ahead of us tonight. It's Wednesday morning, and he has just started his day. Alex's research interests are political Islam and contemporary Indonesian politics. His articles have appeared in refereed journals such as Asia Policy, transnational and regional studies of Southeast Asia, Asian security, Asian politics and policy, Islam and Christian Muslim relations, and the Journal of Southeast Asian Economies. Each of our two guests tonight will make about a 10-minute opening statement on the topic before we open it up for questions. Then, after their presentations, we'll begin with a couple of questions submitted previously by those of you who have registered for the webinar in advance. And then finally, you attendees who are with us tonight can put additional questions as we move along in the Q&A link or the chat room at the bottom of your screens. And Professor Schatzinger and I will read these to the panelists for their comments later. So let us begin. And I'd like to offer a general question to each of the scholars. And so, Professor Abu Talebi, what do you see as the prerequisites from the political and governmental side for a hospitable relationship between Islam and democracy?
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Ripon College and the colleagues for inviting me. Hopefully, we're going to have a fruitful discussion. Let me prelude by simply saying that the title of tonight's discussion is "Can Islam and Democracy Coexist?" Which is a different matter than Islam and democracy, whether they're compatible or not. The distinction, I think, is important because in the long Western tradition, we have come to appreciate what is the so-called separation of church and state, going back to early 1500s experiences until the present. And we are at the moment where supposedly we have this menu of economic and social and political rights and civil liberties that we kind of cherish. Having said that, the second point, a simple point, is that the Western experiences with the idea of democracy and what is known as separation, which really is not the right designation, because even in the case of the United States, we have in the First Amendment, we have the Establishment Clause, no establishment of religion, so to speak. And that simply means religion and politics always interact. You know, you cannot just simply say they don't matter. Obviously, abortion and minority rights, etc., today remains an important issue as well. So let's have that in mind, that politics and religion always interact. It's not just the question of a wall, institutional wall, so to speak. Going back to Western tradition again, what we know from experience, from history and philosophy, etc., is that the democracy is a process and is a never-ending process. That is, democracy is not an end. It's a form of political party that in a very long time process, I'm talking about 600 years, in the Western tradition, we've reached to the point that we can call ourselves democracy, or some say polyarchy, as Robert Dahl used to call it. In this process, which goes back to the early 1500s, with the separation of church and state, so to speak, we initially had what? We had the absolutist states riding in Europe. We have the dominance of the state versus religion. And, you know, it was not till about 1648, the beginning of the rise of modern state, and it was not later till about French Revolution and American Revolution, and going through the kind of expansion of the idea of democracy, coming to 20th century, and eventually women in the United States getting the right to vote in 1920, and even in France, but after World War II. So democracy is a process, and it takes decades or centuries for it to develop, and we are where we are. That's number one. Number two, the question is whether this process that has happened in the West necessarily applies to the East or others. Should the rest of the world follow the same logic, the same processes in terms of democracy? And number four, again, the question is, what is democracy? And what do we mean by that? Are we talking about a menu of political rights, or also we are attaching civil liberties to that? And if so, like in the West, to what extent civil rights or civil liberties can be a necessary part of democracy? So we have a variety of experience around the world. Countries may call themselves democratic, but yet lacking that set of menu of civil liberties and civil rights. Even today, I was reading this morning about France, of course. France is a good kind of example of Europeans where Muslim minority, you're talking about 8% of the population, of France is being Muslim. They live in a kind of democratic environment, and yet France has a dual crisis of welfare state and immigration and minority rights that they're trying to tackle with. They are trying to further absorb Muslim population, and they have been hit with some acts of terrorism, which unfortunately they blame it on Islamists. They should have mentioned Muslim militant, not Islamists per se. I can talk about that later. But they also are having a crisis of welfare state that they cannot, they're eroding welfare state, and they're dealing with the question of immigrants, etc. So in a democracy, even in the Western tradition, the issue of minority and the issue of identity remains an issue. Look at the United States of America. Race is a paramount aspect of US politics. When you talk about African Americans, the minorities, and women, etc., minorities. So democracy is not an end. It is a form of political system which tries to deal with the issue of identity, issue of distribution of power, I would call, between the state and society, and within state and society. So democracy is to be understood as a kind of power competition between the state and society, and within the state and within society. And once you have a more or less balanced environment, you could have a political system which is democratic. So when you think about that formulation, at the basic, going back to your question, obviously we need the rule of law. That should be paramount. There should be the primacy of a constitution, agreed upon principles of constitution that should exist. There should be what Robert Dahl used to call elite cooperation. That is, if we don't have elite cooperation, you may not resolve the initial differences among the elite and leading to crisis. Primary example is the founding fathers in this country, that they cooperated in terms of understanding what they mean by issue of democracy, whereby they knew that they're excluding the non-white, non-property owner, male minority, etc. A very small minority was getting the right to vote, and yet the country considered itself to be democratic, having a constitution, etc. So democracy, of course, grew over the processes, over the century and a half or more. But initially, elite cooperation was paramount in terms of resolving that issue. There must be presence of political institutions. You cannot have political democracy without institutions. Samuel Huntington, also said long while ago, Samuel Huntington, if you don't have political parties, you cannot have a political democracy per se. And then there should be a question of accountability and transparency and meritocracy. That is, you should have a system where not only rule of law exists, but appointment to political positions are based on merit, meritorious, and the actions of the state is open and is transparent. Furthermore, what else do you have? You need at least certain level of economic development. So if you go to a very poor, underdeveloped society and try to impose or export democracy, i.e. we try to do in Afghanistan, you will have a host of different set of problems. So you need a certain level of economic development, and many of us associate that with the rise of middle class, that the middle class should be present in terms of the society being more hospitable to democracy. In more recent time, we also talk about civil society. It's not just necessary for a society to exist, a middle class to exist, but society also should be organized along clubs and associations and groups, etc., in order to counterbalance the power of the state. That's why I talk about power as the essence, an important essence of democracy, because states anywhere have the tendency to monopolize power. The state among democracies, today's democracies, they monopolize power as much as they could till the rise of more modern democracy. And even today, the example of President Donald Trump may indicate that was always the question of push and pull when it comes to the question of the balance of power between state and society. So civil society matters also, whether it exists or not. And then, of course, once you have this, then you could introduce an element of religion, i.e. Islam, in the mix. But in terms of Islam itself, there's a lot to be said that I'm going to wait and maybe talk about that in Q&A. But when it comes to Islam, at least we got to understand the basics. That Islam is a way of life in a way. That Islam is not just a matter of politics or economy and society, and Islam is enshrined within people's belief system, etc. So that's something you have to have in mind. So when we talk about separation of church and state, so to speak, Islam is a lot more complex than what has happened in the West in terms of Christianity, etc. We can talk about that later. Another thing about Islam, and we have to have in mind when we talk about Islam and democracy, you have to talk about whose Islam we are talking about. Islam of the masses, of the ulama or the clerics, Islam of the philosophers, Islam of the modernist or traditionalist or fundamentalist. So here we are, we have a big mess, and you see a variety of that in the Islamic world in terms of movements. Some are more organized than others. Some are very much traditionalist, like the Taliban or Daesh movement. Some are a lot more enlightened and open-minded, so to speak. And we can talk about Indonesia, you can talk about Turkey, you can talk about somebody in Tunisia, etc. So we have to talk about that. So here the point is that whether the Muslim leaders or Islamists can organize themselves and participate in a democratic political systems agreeable and in line with, in tune with the Constitution, the rule of law, and transparency and accountability that we have already mentioned that. And that's the biggest challenge in Islamic countries. So, excuse me, we can talk about that in just a few minutes. One more thing about Islamic countries, and the question, going back to the question of democracy, have in mind indirectly, as you said in your opening, unfortunately, a lot of people associate Islam with the sense of radicalism and militantism that exists in the Islamic world. And the Islamic world overall, quote unquote, as Macron of France said, is in crisis. I don't call Islam being in crisis, but Islam is obviously has been trying for a long time to face up against modernity and modernization. And I I see the signal. I'll stop in just a minute or two. But when it comes to the question of Islam, Islamic leadership, what type of Islam, what country is important? Let's not put all 57 Muslim countries in one basket and then say they're all Muslim, therefore they're all this or that. Number two, again, be careful about the causes of authoritarianism in the Islamic world. Most of us would argue the fundamental causes are structural, economic, social, political, and have nothing to do or little to do with Islam. So if Muslim countries are not fundamentally democratic, it's not due to Islam, but because of structural variables. And for Islam to exist, democracy needs to come first. So democracy can be a hospitable place for Islam, provided that Islam and Muslim leaders can also adjust themselves to the norms of values and structure of democracy. Let me stop here. I know I see the signal. We can talk.
Thank you, Professor Abu Talebi. Dr. Arifianto, given what Professor Abu Talebi has explained, it's necessary for a hospitable relationship between Islam and democracy. How has your research on the Indonesian case specifically illustrated some of these characteristics from both the political and the religious side?
Thank you for your question, Brian. Good evening, everyone. Good morning from here in Singapore. It's good that, thanks to this virtual technology, I'm able to speak with all of you, even when I live, halfway around the world. And it's good to see some of the, familiar faces from different colleagues on this webinar as well. Regarding your questions, I think basically the scholars who study the relationship between, political Islam and Islam in democracy in, Muslim majority societies, basically concluded that there are three things that basically make a Muslim majority society to be to have more consolidated form of democracy compared to the rest. I think firstly is that basically there is there is the need to have healthy and diverse civil society associations in the society. And by civil society associations, it includes a wide range of associations, whether it's secular or whether it's religious, Islamic, or whether they're politically active or not. Doesn't matter, but it's just but you have this diversity, and that also allows all these groups to interact with one another, and at the same time they also these civil society associations are able to check the power of the ruler, whether it's a secular ruler or whether it is a religious one. So the importance of civil society associations is very important. In the case of Indonesia, Indonesia has two large Muslim association, the Nahdlatul Ulama, which has 60 million members, and the Muhammadiyah, which probably have between 15 to 20 million members. Both groups have been existence for nearly a century now, so they are very well rooted within the Indonesian society, and the thing is they also have been included in the politics of Indonesia since the country declared its independence in 1945. And that is the second point that I want to make across: the importance of inclusion in making Islamic associations to become players in the game, and at the same time they also become moderate players. Because the thing is, what distinguishes the Indonesia's experience from that of other Muslim countries like Turkey is that in Indonesia we never have this sense of strict secularism, where the state is fully secular, and religious Muslim groups are completely excluded from politics. In Indonesia, Muslim associations like Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah have always been part of Indonesian politics from the time of the country's independence. Of course, in different regimes, their degree of participation is different. Of course, during the time of authoritarian rule of Suharto, these groups are not as included. But having said that, they were not completely excluded from the society as well, even during this period. And the thing is, because of this history of political inclusion, both Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah over a long period of time have moderated their political ideology. In 1945, both of them wanted Indonesia to become an Islamic state. And both of them rejected the country's national ideology, the Pancasila, which according to them is based on secularism like Turkey used to have. But over time, what happened is that they decided to moderate themselves. That the leaders of Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah by the 1980s have adopted a very different position. That Pancasila is not secular. There is actually Islamic values implemented in the ideology, and we Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah have contributed to the development of these Islamic values. So it is not something that we should oppose, but it is part of the identity of our organization as well. But of course, but the point is, over a period of nearly 40 years, the political theology of both groups evolved. And I would argue they were evolving because of the history of political inclusion, that for decades, Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah members were part of the cabinet, and then they were also participated in elections. Both of them have their own political parties. And so because of this long period of inclusion, over time, they see themselves as part of Indonesian society as well, alongside their more secularist counterpart. And then over time, they also reject the attempt to take political power using more radical and more violent means. So my point is that there is a well-established literature in the study of Islam and politics about the so-called inclusion can bring moderation into Islamic groups. That when you include Islamic group in politics, treated them as equal partners with other parties, whether it's secular or not. Over time, their ideology would be adopted into one that accepting moderation, and at the same time also probably less supportive of the idea that the country needs to be an Islamic state. And the last point I wanted to make is that the political scientist Alfred Stefan has came out with this concept of twin tolerations, that basically while the state can be politically secular, it is more ideal for it to include every member of society, including religious groups. That basically they were not to be excluded completely, like the experience of some Middle Eastern countries like Turkey and Egypt and so forth, but instead they need to be included. And based on my account of the Indonesian political experience, that is exactly what has happened. That because of this inclusion of the country's two largest Islamic group, NU and Muhammadiyah, over time they become moderate and accepting of political, democratic and moderate political norms within their group. And so I think I conclude here, and this is basically the secret why Indonesia has become a more durable democracy over the past 2 decades since the fall of the authoritarian rule of General Suharto in 1998.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rifianto. Thank you, both of you. Let's begin with a couple of questions that were submitted by people who registered earlier for the webinar. So, Henrik, would you pick a question to give the two panelists?
Sure. I hope it's okay if I take the freedom just to ask one follow-up question.
Sure, go ahead.
In this case, it's Ali. You were talking about sort of that we have to be careful about the causes of authoritarianism in Islamic countries and not just point to religion so quickly. Was it willing to talk about some of the common causes or common threads that we have seen that these regimes have been able to kind of exploit?
Yes, of course. The history of nation-state building, that is, when you talk about a country, you want to create a nation plus a state that runs it, and the relationship between state and society, by implication and historically, has been an uneven one. When you think about the rise of German state, for example, in late 1800s, when you think about the development of democracy in the West, for centuries we saw absolutism in Europe till the French Revolution. And even after that, with the rise of Napoleon, etc., we did not see democracy. So democracy in 1900s in Europe pretty much is a far cry from democracy today. Similarly, in the Middle East, that I can talk about a little bit with more authority, and in developing countries for the most part, we saw a lot of decolonization after World War II. So in the Arab world in particular, or in Iran for that matter, we saw the initial flirting with the right of a state and building nation state. You have to create a sense of nationhood among different ethnic groups and tribal groups and different religions, etc. And that's a long, tall order. It took Europe at least 2 centuries plus, and they expect that to happen in the Middle East in a matter of 20, 30 years. In the process, in reality, unexpectedly, what has happened is that the state have accumulated a lot of power because the state has the military, the bureaucracy, and the state has the force, the middle coercion. And many of the Arab countries we talked about, the state have not been able to adequately form and shape a modern nation state. That's why you see many of the Arab oil-producing frontier states, you see the state have become a cash cow, so to speak. That state is a way for elite to kind of catch and enrich themselves as opposed to anything else. You see many of the Arab countries, as well as to some extent Iran, although it's changing, you see the main source of state income is not taxation. You know, the taxation is low and it comes from either oil or, for example, volunteerism or foreign aid or tourism or anything else. The state itself is macho, is strong, but it's not really capable. So there's a difference between effective state and strong dominating states. So in developing countries, we have rather this lopsided relationship between the state and society, where much of the power is in the hands of the state, and society is at the mercy of the state, and where kind of civil society begin to grow, or society begin to change through more education, through more income, through urbanization, etc. The state still continue to monopolize institutions of politics and kind of deprive the people access to power, to the political process. So in the developing countries, fundamentally, we see this. We see lack of socioeconomic development. We see domination of the state, particularly the executive branch of the state. We see military rule over society. We see basically power of the elite at the expense of the people. And you can see that all over, whether it's Sub-Saharan Africa or in Arab Middle East, etc. Many of these states, again, are byproduct of post-World War II events, of decolonization, and a very short period and trying to build a nation state and maybe become democratic. Among this, there's a caveat, again, then I should be quiet. When you look at the tiger states or mini tigers, when you talk about South Korea, when you talk about later in Brazil, Argentina, maybe Singapore, Taiwan, these are the states that became democratic and developed after World War II, but fundamentally they differ from much of the rest of the developing countries. And the difference is this, that many of fundamentally these countries, they were caught in the web of Cold War and became American allies. And US kind of intervention helped them to slowly to kind of grow economically, socially, and later become politically democratic. Remember, none of these countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, none of them were democratic till 1970s and 80s. Even Japan was dominated by one party, or Liberal Democratic Party for decades. So the prosperous countries who made it, who had a bit of a reservoir of human capital to grow, also took them decades before they become democratic. So I guess my message is that, yes, there are so many social, economic, political, cultural elements contributing to absence or presence of democracy, and the picture is a lot complex.
Okay, we have a question from a couple of other people. We have a current student who will graduate this year, and also an alumna from the class of 1999. And here are their questions. and either one of you can answer this, or maybe both of you can. What role does American policy play in hindering the democratization of the Islamic world? For example, American support of the Egyptian military political complex as opposed to a democratic Egypt. And what policy should the US government pursue under the Biden administration with Islamic majority countries today? So if one or both of you could make comments on that, I think the registrants would appreciate it.
Okay, I think I'll answer the question about the Biden administration's policy toward the Muslim majority nations. I think firstly, the Biden administrations need to return to the policy adopted by the Obama administration to re-engage with the Muslim majority nations and to treat them as potential partners of the United States instead of potentially hostile element. I think now the U.S. needs to show to the rest of the Muslim majority nations in the world, be in the Middle East or in South Asia or in Southeast Asia, is that the U.S. sees them as potential partners, both in political as well as in economic norms, and that the U.S. is moving away from the policy implemented by the Trump administration, such as the Muslim ban or the restrictions toward immigration from immigrants from Muslim majority nations and so forth. But having said that, at the same time, I think the administration need also to address some of the concerns of as many of these Muslim countries with regard to certain policies. Most Muslim majority nations wanted the U.S. wanted a resolution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and a resolution that would have involved a two-state solution instead of a one-state solution. And I think over the past 4 years, unfortunately, with the encouragement from the Trump administration, the Israeli regime have absorbed more of the voice of the Palestinians, and then basically try to further marginalize them. As hard as it is in the U.S., given the political difficulties surrounding the issues, this is something that I think one of the things that the Biden administration need to resolve. It need to try to persuade the Israeli government to go back to the negotiating table, negotiate with the Palestinian Authority to have a two-state solution into the situation, because this is going to be the #1 concern of many Muslim majority nations. And of course, the second issue would be how to resolve the Iranian nuclear deal. But I leave the details of this to Ali later on. Okay, Ali, you want to take in? You want to continue?
Yes. Well, I am of the opinion that U.S. foreign policy fundamentally has played a negative role in many countries, including the country that I study closely, Middle East. Fundamentally, it's played a negative role. When you look at U.S. policy in the Middle East in post-World War II, it was a three-tier policy. Fundamentally, anti-communism and containment of communism, internationalism, and support for the state of Israel, and stability over democracy. The United States policy in post-World War II was never interested in democracy in the Middle East. Obviously, they killed off Iranian chances for democracy in 1953 coup d'etat in Iran. They did the same thing in Iraq in 1963. They supported very strongly and lopsidedly the Israeli war against the Arabs, no matter who's at fault, etc. And the Arab states spend a lot of energy on preparation for war and wasting resources, etc., and using any excuse not to move for democracy, etc. So in more recent time, post-Cold War, of course, is all over, right? Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Somalia, Afghanistan. All these interventions fundamentally have killed off any chances for a state to try to find itself or try to build the foundation of democracy. Now, of course, we are living in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the future, perhaps, with trillions of dollars spent and claiming that the initial goal was to bring democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. Nation-state building in Afghanistan after 20 years has failed. Opium production has gone up by 10 times. And Afghan society is a tad better off, but it's still a far cry from being democratic. And in case of Iraq, of course, Iran is picking up the pieces with through close relationship with Iraq and etc. In Syria, again, the country is devastated. So is Yemen, so is Somalia, etc. So the war on terrorism basically has brought a lot of victims, the majority of whom are Muslim. And all of that breeds more dislike. I don't want to use the hatred, but dislike toward American policy. It's famously said in the region that people are not, they don't hate Americans, they love Americans, but they hate American policy. So they hate what the US does, as opposed to anything else. So in that light, I think, look at Morsi. I mean, Morsi was in office for about 11 months, about a year, and he was overthrown. And we know for facts that the US and the Saudi military, they basically brought his downfall and the coup d'etat in Egypt. So that again goes back to what Alex said. The United States has this kind of vision that all Muslim movements are the same and are anti-democratic, anti-modern. And as Alex was trying to say, Indonesia, a policy of inclusion has led to more moderation of Islamic movements. And I'm for it. I think Muslim Brotherhood, for example, movement in Egypt, which had a chance, and they won the election through ballots. Morsi won by about 52%. But yes, there were a lot of opposition, but he easily was overthrown. But through inclusion and trial and error, I think we can reach some kind of a conclusion. Another example, let me elaborate what I mean. Another example is Iran. I have a minute or? Another example is Iran. Through process of trial and error in the last 40 years, Iranian government is trying to figure out whether Islam and republicanism can go hand in hand. I can talk about that later. So I am of the opinion that you gotta let Muslim groups to take over if they play by democratic rules, the foundations, the fundamentals, and let them try it. And in the end, they either totally fail and these societies become totally secular, or in the process, they find some kind of formulation. And that's exactly what happened in a reverse order in Turkey. Turkey went through a process of forced Western or secularization, and Islam has refound itself by the 1980s and coming back. So trial and error is important. Inclusion can bring about moderation. US policy overall, under the disguise of war on terror or stability in the region, had fundamentally worked against democracy in the region. Because as we said, US has gone to bed with everybody in the Middle East, except with Democrats. And the prime example are of the 30 Arab states. Let me stop and then we can talk.
Henrik, could you offer a question perhaps from the Q&A?
Yeah, let me do that. I'm going to mute the other people here so it's a little bit easier to understand me. This is a question from Soren Hauge. He is a member of the Ripon College faculty. And he says, I heard the panelists say that the development of civil society, including religious organizations and their inclusion in political processes, is crucial to developing compatibility of Islam and democracy in the countries with states that dominate the economy and channel wealth to political elites hinder this. So the question is, in this case, can economic liberalization, that is the reduction of state ownership and control, help to make space for the necessary development of civil society that includes a constructive role for Islam? Could maybe, perhaps both of you briefly sort of speak to the importance of economic liberalization?
Okay, thanks, Henrik, and thank you, Soren. This is a very interesting, very thought-provoking question. I think, well, economic liberalization is, of course, very important. I mean, many Muslim majority nations, Indonesia included, have basically largely state-dominated economies. Even to this day, and of course, I think more some form of liberalization might be welcome, but I think in my opinion, it is more important to promote policies that promote equality and greater distribution of wealth, compared to economic liberalization per se. Because, for instance, I think part of the reason why you have the so-called Islamic fundamentalism or growing Islamism in many Muslim majority nations is not necessarily because of religion theology per se, but because of the concerns from Muslims that the wealth distribution is not equal. It's stacked in the middle of the political elite who run the countries. And the Islamists often seize this theme to basically to combine elements of religious hardline ideology with element of economic populism. That, hey, if you want to, if you join us to advocate for, to replace the government with an Islamic state, when we are in power, we're going to create, a more, just, a more prosperous economy that works for everybody, not just for the political elite. So the thing is that, so the point is, a lot of the sources of popular support toward Islamism is not theology, but is economic per se, because of the persistence of economic inequality and persistence of poverty, corruption, as well as unequal distribution of wealth. I think instead of engaging in economic liberalization per se, I think one thing the state can do is to promote small businesses, often set up by Islamic organization themselves, to help, for instance, Muhammadiyah, one of Indonesia's largest Muslim organization, has a network of charities, public healthcare providers, and education providers that help to promote economic, educational, and economic opportunities for poor Muslims. This type of initiative must be, in my view, must be supported by the state in order to to reduce economic inequality, and also to put an end at the source of Islamic radicalism and extremism. So, Ali, do you want to add to this?
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, absolutely. I agree with you that, and the question that the liberal economic approach can help to break down the power, the monopoly power of the state to some extent, to maybe to a large extent. I think that's important in terms of engagement. In terms of equality, I agree with you. I think many developing countries, many Muslim countries or developing countries, they share with other developing countries the dilemma of neoliberal approach to economic growth, etc. Because it's not just about economic growth, it's also about distribution and equality. And that basically means the state, the welfare state, be dominant, and they could have regulations to try to redistribute resources. And that is antithetical with the idea of less powerful state. So that's, everybody understand what I'm saying. You know, when in Europe, you see the state being welfare state, but being democratic. In developing countries, they want to liberalize and become smaller, but yet they need regulations and they need welfare state policies, which again, that demand more bureaucracy, more regulation, etc. With the small businesses, I agree. A good contrasting differences between Turkey and Egypt. In Turkey, we have a lot of small businesses, entrepreneurs who have embraced Islam, but they're part of mainstream middle class in Turkey, as opposed to Egypt, where the Egyptian Islamist movement, the economy is dominated by bigger enterprises, including the military, which runs 30-35%, maybe more of the economy of Egypt. Just pretty much similarly in Iran, that the military is a big economic actor, and there's a lot of emphasis on big enterprises and not necessarily middle classes. So this is a very crucial point. One way to promote the idea of democracy is to promote the growth of small businesses in developing Muslim countries, including again Iran or Egypt, Indonesia, as is the case, and elsewhere.
For the sake of time, we're beginning to get towards the latter half. I'd like to read several questions from people who have very different views about the Middle East and about Islam. And to give them their voice, I would like to read. These are alums from the college. One alum said, how can Muslims justify peaceful coexistence with other religions when there are very specific instructions in the Quran to convert or kill infidels? Second question, given the difficulties that Israel has had with Muslims, do you think Islam is plausible at all in a democratic environment? And have not the Abraham Accords that President Trump initiated made the Palestinians a non-factor now in terms of the future of a two-state solution? So these are a number of questions. Take them any way you want, but there are obviously people who don't necessarily agree that Islam is hospitable to democracy. Who wants to start?
Okay, Ali, you want to start this time?
Okay, there we go. The question of Islam and long discussion. Islam is as violent or as peaceful as is the Bible or the Torah. This is not the right question, because that's what the topic of the tonight discussion is: coexistence, not necessarily compatibility, because none of the religions that we talk about, Abrahamic religions, are compatible with democracy. So Islam is no more violent or peaceful than Judaism or Christianity. We can talk about that in different contexts. So that's at least my opinion. Secondly, the question of Israel question. Well, of course, there's a long discussion, but Israel is a country which is surrounded by 22 Arab countries, as well as Iran and Turkey, which are not necessarily very friendly to Israel. Of course, Iran being hostile as well. Although Iran before revolution was very warm and friendly, and Iran actually used to sell oil to Israel and have military cooperation with Israel. That tells me what? That government matters. Iranian people, Iranian Muslims, did not overturn or overnight did not turn into terrorists or radicals. It was the change of regime that basically brought about new ideology and new policy. So the state matters. The ideology of the state matters, and what the state does matter. So having said that, so what does matter is a policy in Israel. Israel must come to realization that it must deal with the 22 Arab states as well as Iran and Turkey, because Israel is in a very troublesome neighborhood, and Israel has technology and other means to provide to his neighboring countries should there be peace. But the peace, based on what we know, based on your resolution 242, 1967, asking for a two-state solution, is just almost not there anymore. I've become so pessimistic that to the point that I argue sometimes that two-state solution is dead. Abraham Accords is fundamentally is asking for the Palestinians to surrender and kind of an Arab state to sell out. In a way, we kind of offer Palestinians a lot of money here, $20 billion, we'll gather, be happy, let Israel take over. This is not a peace resolution. So what Accord is about peace settlement. If you want to do peace settlements, yeah, Abrahamian Accord might be a solution, but it's not a peace resolution. A peace settlement, even if it's imposed, it will not last. It will not last. You can mark my words on that. If you want to really come up with a solution, the blueprint is two-state solution based on 1967 242 idea. And for that, again, everybody knows what that is. And that requires a lot of sacrifice on the part of both peoples. Let me stop here and then hand it to Alex.
Okay, thank you, Ali. I think with regard to religious toleration and Muslim non-Muslim relations, I think something that is that Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama has just issued within the past 2 years is a new religious opinion or fatwa that basically said that Muslim cannot call a non-Muslim to be evil or to be kafir when it comes to and I think that NU decided to make this ruling is because they believe based on their interpretation of Islamic scriptures is that the word kafir is not offensive to non-Muslims, and that as a religion that live within a plural society like Indonesia, where yes, 88% of the population is Muslim, but you have about another 12% of the countries are non-Muslim, including 10% Christians. That the fact that you have to treat non-Muslims as equal citizens, and as long as you refer to them as kafir, you're basically excluding them from participation of into the political life of a democratic and plural society. I mean, this news, of course, did not is little known outside of Indonesia. But I think this is a very significant development. Is that NU issued this fatwa not just based from the religious text, but also from its experience of living as a Muslim organization in a plural society, and then they have a long history of working together with non-Muslims. They promote religious dialogue, religious tolerance, and so forth. So that's why they can put forward saying that, if you want to live together in peace with everybody, including with non-Muslims, you cannot call them kafir any longer. You have to call them as equal citizens, fellow citizens in that could work together in bringing the nation together. And I think this is ruling like this should be something that other Muslim organizations throughout the world should adopt. Because the reality is that our world has become global. Most countries have sizable. Most Muslim countries have small yet significant non-Muslim minorities, and all of them are deserve to be treated, as equal citizens, and not being treated as infidels.
Thank you. Henrik, you have a question, I think, about the Arab Spring.
Yes, we have received a couple of questions from our participants, both pre-submitted as well as tonight. And they're really just interested in the impact of the Arab Spring. So, for example, Mehdi Al-Yunzi, he's a Ripon alum, asks, was the Arab Spring proof that Islamist extremists will take advantage of a new democracy to gain more power? For example, if you look at Tunisia and Egypt. We also have Marty Farrell, Ripon College former professor, and he's asking, from the perspective of almost 10 years now, how would you assess the 2011's Arab Spring movement and the reasons for their relative success or lack thereof? I don't know who would like to speak to that.
Ali, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Again, if my fingers doesn't match my phone, what have you, is bigger for the phone. So Arab Spring, of course, we call it Arab Winter now because it happened in 2011, and there was so much optimism but all hands like me, we were very extremely cautiously optimistic. But soon it turned out that no, it's not going to go anywhere. And fundamental reason that Arab Spring didn't go anywhere, because the Arab movements were, quote unquote, became more spontaneous. Although the new generation, the effect of media and new internet, etc., and the young people, they were enthusiastic for challenging the state and establishing democracy. But the states in the region were all hands, and they were not easily going to give up the power. That was a fundamental problem. And of course, the only successful case we know is Indonesia. And in Indonesia, the Islamists took over, but they voluntarily gave up power through election. Let's not forget that. That's why we say Indonesia is a hopeful sign. Of course, Indonesia has a very small population, and its history in terms of France and proximity to Europe make Indonesia a little bit more unique. The opposite to that, of course, is Egypt, whereby there was a chance for Morsi and cohorts to come in and try to figure it out, but they were soon overthrown from abroad. The cynical Abu Talebi says fundamentally that the Arab states were not ready to let off the power go, because as I said, state in many Arab countries is a cash cow, is where you enrich yourself, particularly among the frontier states, among the states with a lot of oil and natural gas resources in the Persian Gulf region. You know, they were the royal family or small families, they dominate and they own everything. Why would they want to let go? So, and in some other ones, of course, the movement was suffocated by the state, whether it's in Syria, and of course, with external intervention, United States over Libya. So external forces worked against it. Internally, people were not ready and the state dominated. And as I said before, US policy, other than the European, I would say, for the most part, are interested in stability, flow of oil and natural gas and investment, etc., and not necessarily democracy. Just recall how Sarkozy was so excited along with the American administration. Oh, Libya is going to be free. It's going to be freedom, liberty. None of that happened. As soon as Gaddafi fell, everybody abandoned Libya. And in Syria, again, unfortunately, these are documentary factors there. As in case of Syria and in Libya, indirectly, we supported some of these radical Muslim groups to try to overthrow Assad regime. In a way, we were in cahoots with some of the people that we are fighting against. So do your own homework, your own research. So we preach democracy, but yet we're in cahoots with some of the most radical, most obviously Jabhat al-Nusra, the main opposition in Syria, which was receiving money and support from Turkey from the United States and elsewhere in order to overthrow Saddam regime. So politics matter, and in the end, Arab Spring fell. But this is a long discussion. I cannot talk about all of this. But Marty, again, I guess he was interested in all that. I think for the Arab states, obviously, you need to return to normalcy, the state. But for the United States, if you want to promote the notion of freedom, democracy, etc., we have to stop supporting many of the Arab states, which are dominating states. But I know the picture is a lot more complex than this. I stop and let Alex have to say about this.
Okay, thanks, Ali. Yeah, I think one fact that many observers have overlooked about the Arab Spring is that even though the experience of democratization in most of these countries are unfortunately not successful, there is one country that has relatively successful in becoming democratized. And many are saying that, it's slowly but surely consolidating democracy. And this country is Tunisia. And the reason for that, I think it's and if you ask me why, I guess it goes back to this theory of inclusion moderation. Is that even though, yes, historically, Tunisia is like Turkey, that previously the Bourguiba regime have a strict laicity policy. Islamic groups were completely excluded from the governance of the country for many decades. But what happened was somewhere in the I forgot if it's 1980s or 1990s, the leader of the of Ennahda party, the largest Islamic association in Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi, decided that he's going to abandon the idea of, well, if we take power, Tunisia has to be transformed into an Islamic state. He abandoned this idea somewhere in the 1980s. And instead, we're going to promote Tunisia as a democratic nation instead. And by democratic nation, we mean that, it's a nation where, Muslim group and can work together with, secularist parties, non-Muslims, and so forth. So I think what happened was that, because he made this move for maybe at least 20 years before, Arab Spring happened and Ben Ali regime fell. I think what happened was that his party can negotiate with other parties that are more secular. And then basically they are able to, come together and form political coalition that include, his party versus and also more secular party. And I think part of the reason why, Tunisia's democratization seems to hold, and it did not it did not result in quick reversal like what happened in Egypt is because of this, because the Muslim group and the secularists able to get together, and at the same time, the most dominant Muslim group also made the first move, saying that we're going to abandon our idea for an Islamic state, but instead we're going to promote a democratic, plural society as well. So the process of inclusion that leads into moderation seems to be the key in leading to the successful democratizations of several Muslim majority nations, be it Indonesia, be it Tunisia, Senegal, and so forth. If you look at one common denominator of why democratization is successful in these countries vis-a-vis other Muslim nations, is because of this, because the Muslim group were included as part of the political game for a longer period. And as a result of this inclusion, over time they become more moderate and can be more accepting of democracy.
We're coming to the close of our webinar. I'd like to give you each 3 minutes. And what 1 or 2 ideas would you like to leave us with of all the things that you've said tonight? Think about 1 or 2 things in your presentation, in your discussion. Maybe it might be something that wasn't emphasized enough. What do you want to leave us with tonight in terms of the relationship between Islam, politics, and democracy? Ali, do you want to go first?
Surely. I'll go back to the very beginning. That is, when you think about 1.5, 1.6 billion Muslims, if not more, 57 countries are Muslim members of Organization of Islamic Conference, as well as India. They have 150 million Muslims. When you think about Muslim countries, do not color all with the same brush. Do not generalize. Do not generalize Islam. We did not even talk about a variety of Islam that exists in many of these countries, Sunni, Shia, etc. As such, when you come to generalization about Muslim this or that, when you talk about Islamophobia, when you think about terrorism, I've always complained about the media using even the term Islamist that is so commonly used. Islamist really initially was a term associated with Muslim reformists who wanted democracy and modernity, not as radicals. So simple modification. Refer to these people as militant Muslims, not militant Islam, not Islamists. If you do that, you basically send a message that understand there are militants who happen to be Muslim. It's not that they are Islamic, therefore they are terrorists. And this is also a problem, of course, for Macron and France, etc. The state is getting engaged in trying to tame all this Islamic movements, but the state perhaps is going too far. So do not generalize. Be appreciative of the diversity of Islam and Muslims. And when it comes to the question of democracy, have in mind that democracy is only a political system type, and it takes time for different societies and countries to reach there. And democracy is not the end game. It's always part of a political development process. In this country, we see how we have been in trouble lately. And in France, they see the same thing. There's always a question of identity. There's always a question of church and state relationship. There's always a question of technology and change. And every society is successful that is successfully respond to these changes and adjust itself. And if we don't, you're doomed. So a primary example in the Islamic world is Iran. Iran, 42 years after revolution, through process of trial and error, trying to bring a balance between republicanism and Islam. And more recently, Islam is winning more than republicanism. But at any rate, Iranian nation with over 3,000 years of history, it will figure it out. That goes back to what Alex said, in terms of inclusion and process. The process will work it out. In the meantime, I beg American foreign policy makers, please do not interfere in these countries. Because if you interfere, you radicalize groups, because they would be labeled as pro-American, pro-liberals, and that would radicalize many politics in those countries. And if you interfere in the name of democracy and support the state, you're supporting states which are authoritarian and are despised by their own government, by their own people. So American foreign policy has a dilemma in terms of intervention or not. This is a long discussion, perhaps in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Alex, your concluding remarks.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. I think I would second Ali's last point. Is that I think intervention, especially against government that are democratically elected, in favor of a regime that is that is perceived to be more secular but also authoritarian, is usually the one that over the long run could lead to the growing popularity of Islamism and Islamic fundamentalism. I think you've seen this phenomena in many countries that have a long history of intervention, be it Egypt, be it Iran, as well as others. And I think this is something that the Biden administration should definitely stay away from. I think another point I want to make across is that Islam is a very decentralized and very plural region, very plural religion, and it is becoming increasingly so in the 21st century because of the rise of the so-called internet ustad, or internet clerics that have challenged the authority of traditional ulama and so forth. It became more plural, but having said that, that's why you cannot generalize about that. That all Muslims are thinking alike, all Muslims have the same ideologies, and or not, because the simple fact is that the growing pluralization and decentralization of the religion make more very different point of view from Muslims even within their own societies. Some embrace democracy and tolerance, but others are not. But a lot of it has, I would argue, also has to do with the history of the society, and more importantly, the role of the inclusion, whether the state has historically include Islamic group into political participation and a debate within that society, or instead whether the state has historically exclude this group and try to repress them because they see all form of Islam to be dangerous. Like I said earlier, the countries that have successfully become democracies, Indonesia, Tunisia, Senegal, is adopting a more inclusive approach, not just immediately, but over a very long period of time. And this is what has distinguished them from the experience of other Muslim nations like Turkey, like Egypt, where you have where authoritarianism seems to be more institutionalized, because the tension between the secularists and the Islamists within the societies were greater. And I think this is something that I think one must view when they view Islamic societies and in Muslim peaceful. All of these countries are unique. They all have different experiences when it comes to religion, democratization, and so forth. And Islam itself is also a very diverse religion with many rooms, with many schools and sects. And just treating and starting your analysis by treating Islam to be the same is simply not going to work because of the complexity of the religion and of the complexity of the society that they live in. Thank you for this. For including me in this webinar. I hope my insight have made you more informed about Islam and democracy. And I want to thank Brian, Henrik, and Ripon College for this opportunity to share my insights to all of you. And I'm sure Ali feels the same as well.
Thank you both for a very interesting discussion and for laying out so many important things we need to keep in mind, not only about Islam and Muslims, but about democracy. And as Ali said, all democracies are in a process of development. We have a ways to go in this country in terms of what Alex said, being all inclusive to all groups. We have a ways to go before we convince some Americans that an authoritarian overthrow of our government is not the way to improve it. So we all need to learn from our own experience and the experience of other countries what it means to work on democracy and what the role of civil society is in either promoting it or undermining it. So we thank you very much tonight, both of you, for your wisdom. And we wish you well in your future research and your work. Henrik, will you take a minute to explain what the next event is that the center is sponsoring in about 2 weeks?
Sure, I will do that. I also really want to thank our panelists. If you have noticed, one thing is that they could talk for an hour to each of those questions, given their level of expertise. I also really want to thank all the participants tonight. Thank you for joining us, for submitting lots of questions, thoughtful questions. And also thank you to my colleague, Brian, who did most of the groundwork here in setting this webinar up. Yeah, we hope you can join us again in a couple of weeks on February 25th, a Thursday at 6:30, so same time. And we will have Dr. Lynn Worley. She is the Director of Sustainable Peacebuilding Programs at UW Milwaukee, and also a professor there. And she will give a presentation on the following question. Why peace is possible, exploring the dimensions of human kindness in the midst of violence. So again, that's February 25th, Thursday, 6:30 p.m. Thank you again to all of you, and we hope you can join us in the future.
Well, thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, and stay safe and stay warm.
Thank you very much. You too.
Good night, everybody.